Welcome to the Future of Supply Chain, presented by Dynamo. Each episode, we sit down with leaders in the industry as we build the future of supply chain together. Let's get into the show. Here's our host, Santosh Sankar.
Hey, ladies and gents, welcome back to the Future Supply Chain Podcast. I'm your host, Santosh Sankar. Joining me today is Peter Goodman, Global Economic Correspondent at the New York Times. Welcome, Peter. It's great to have you on.
Great to be here, Santosh. Thanks for having me.
I am super excited to jump in here and discuss all things related to economics, geopolitics, and of course, supply chain. But to begin, I'd love for you to share the Peter Goodman story and for us to better understand kind of where you spend your time researching and writing on behalf of the New York Times.
Yeah, that's a broad question, but let me try to handle it. I mean, I'm based in New York, grew up in New York. I have spent a lot of my career abroad, started off freelancing in Southeast Asia, especially in Cambodia and Indonesia and Vietnam. I have lived in Alaska as a cub reporter for the Anchorage Daily News for 3 years. I was at the Washington Post for 10 years, including about 6 years in China as the Asian economic correspondent right after China entered the WTO. And for the last 17 years or so, I've been at the New York Times. I was the national economic correspondent during the Great Recession, spent 5 years in London as the European economic correspondent, and now I'm back in my hometown, New York, writing about the global economy.
Amazing. And, jumping into it, this is a very unique year as we all sit here being global citizens. Over half the world's population is either already elected or will elect by year end. Understanding we only have a handful of months left, new leadership. But this is against the backdrop of rising geopolitical conflict, tensions, continued rise in populism and nationalist sentiment, and also changing economic policies and might I even say ideologies that we've long held. And I'd love kind of from your vantage point, how will this all affect supply chain as we say that broadly over the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, I think that place is back. I mean, we've lived through an era of globalization where we've been invited to believe that as long as you've got access to container shipping, you got the internet, you've got some basic infrastructure to move cargo around, it doesn't really matter whether your factory's down the street or on the other side of an ocean. And that is changing. That's changing in part because of, the story that I detail in my most recent book, How the World Ran Out of Everything, the disruptions of the pandemic era. But it's also changing because of geopolitics, which itself reflects domestic politics. And this bleeds into my last book, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World, which looks at Brexit, the rise of Trump, the shift rightward in places like Italy and Sweden, where I argue, if you scratch beneath the surface, and the narrative is usually, immigrants get blamed or outsiders, China gets blamed to the United States for a declining living standards. The reality is that what has tended to happen is the wealthiest people in societies have managed to write the rules in their favor to make it easier to amass more of their wealth. That leads to greater inequality. And then people are aggrieved, and people are not working people are not wrong when they look at the last several decades, and they see pressures on their wages. They see a failure to capture the gains of that we've seen in terms of productivity through wage gains, and so they're angry about it, and that sets up opportunities for right-wing populists to tell usually pretty simplistic stories that will take aim at the global supply chain in part. I mean, as tariffs rise. So I think, the more that we see this backlash to globalization, which is really an expression of the fact that large numbers of people haven't gotten their share of the bounty, we're likely to see trade wars, and that will generate pressure to move production back closer to markets where goods are sold.
I want to kind of jump into your book that you just mentioned, right? How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. You released it in June of this year.
Right.
And I want to dig into a couple aspects of this. First and foremost, I'm curious, what's the inspiration behind writing this? What was kind of that moment where you said, okay, I need to go spend this time, effort, energy and put out this great piece of work?
Well, it was really an accident, to be quite honest. My last book hadn't even come out yet, and I had moved my family from London back to New York. We had a newborn, born in April of 2020. We had a lot going on, and I wasn't looking to write another book. But essentially, there was just so much interest in shortages. I mean, in my own household, it was very personal. Like I say, my kid was born on April 8th, 2020. We're in London. My wife's very stoic about the fact that her family can't fly over from New York to help out with the baby. We can't go see a pediatrician because offices are closed. But where she broke down was where we got home and we tried to order hand sanitizer, face masks. We couldn't find them. We tried to order the ingredients to make our own hand sanitizer. Impossible. And she looked at me, she said, "You're supposed to understand this sort of stuff. What's going on?" And I didn't have a satisfying explanation. I started writing about different aspects of the supply chain crisis, the shortage of computer chips, the incredible spike in shipping rates, and realized that a lot of the story was an excessive embrace of a very sensible concept, just-in-time manufacturing, but excessive in the interest of boosting share prices next quarter for the investor class with the expense of resilience for the rest of us, for businesses, for regular people. And I realized that would require a book length treatment. And once I got back to the States, I started traveling to some ports. I went to the port of Savannah. That led to an episode on the Times podcast, The Daily. And I could tell that this was a story that regular people were now really fascinated by. This wonky thing, the global supply chain, that I never imagined I'd write a book about, actually was quite fascinating when you got into its workings. And it was now something people were talking about, over the dinner table as they tried to figure out why they couldn't get the shade of paint they wanted to complete their renovation, why they couldn't get a Peloton to replace their trip to the gym, why they couldn't get school supplies or really important things like basic medicines.
What was the most surprising thing that you ended up encountering as you really got deep into your research?
I think the extent to which there's a lot of inefficiency in this ruthless pursuit of efficiency for the sake of short-time stock movements. I mean, I'll give you an example. Like, I have a couple chapters on railroads. Railroads from the beginning of American railroad history have been about maximizing short-term gains for investors, often at the expense of operational efficiency. And as I'm looking into this thing called precision scheduled railroading, which is like just in time on the rails, I talked to an engineer at Union Pacific out in Idaho who told me that he was horrified to learn that he was pulling freight to the wrong destination. And this was not by accident. This was because Union Pacific, like every publicly traded railroad, was on the hook to show Wall Street that it was highly efficient by way of lowering dwell time. Your listeners are probably familiar with that concept.
Yep.
That's the amount of time that cargo sits in any particular place. And so somebody running a rail yard for Union Pacific in Nebraska took this imperative to lower dwell time as an invitation to just attach as many rail cars as possible to the next train out of town. Didn't matter where it was going. So as a result, we had, drums full of chemicals that were supposed to be going to Oregon, and they're headed to Southern California. We had, auto parts that somebody's waiting for in California so they can fix a vehicle for a customer, and they're going to the state of Washington. I mean, here's an example of how this ruthless form of efficiency, we're often told we can either have efficiency or resilience, but these two things are in conflict. Well, because of this perverse way in which these monopoly companies are catering to short-term investor interests, there's actually a lot of inefficiency. And I saw this time and again.
I do think, because this is the second time you've kind of raised the whole concept of we have resilience, and then we have this effort around reducing costs, maximizing profit, and that really kind of pushed us to go all in on just in time, maybe to an extreme, if you would.
Right.
And it feels like, even from the vantage point we sit in, the world's trying to figure out what is that happy medium where we're not like fiscally malfeasant, but equally we're not forsaking ourselves when unpredictable episodes or black swan events occur, where we're all caught flat-footed and we don't have the essential things that we need where we need it, in the quantities we need it, and even at the price that we need it.
Right.
Because we equally saw as a result of this massive inflation that we're still grappling with in part. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think that resilience is something that most of us, in our own lives, if we're thinking about, do I want to replace the roof this year? How many extra paper towels do I want in my basement if I've got room? We all understand that intuitively, and it's not that just in time is a bad idea. It was a great idea. I mean, it turned Toyota into the most profitable and successful auto company in history. It's when we handed the keys to business consultancies like McKinsey, totally directed at how do we make share prices go up in the next quarter. So, they would give advice like, well, don't accept inventory, even if you need it. Wait till the end of the quarter. Just stash it out in your parking lot. I mean, I talked for the book, to a guy who was working at this industrial generation company in Minnesota, who had his brush with McKinsey, known as the lean Taliban. If you weren't with the program, you were really in trouble. And he had these kids fresh out of Ivy League schools in slick suits, led by one older guy from the Chicago office, explain how they needed to stop warehousing $5 sheet metal brackets. This was the way they would produce efficiency. And he said, well, this is just nuts. I mean, we're making these industrial generators that have to be installed at things like hospitals with cranes. Talk about just in time. If we miss that window, that's a real problem. And sure enough, for lack of a $5 sheet metal bracket, they're now having to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in expedited freight and have to explain to longstanding customers why they can't deliver on time.
Mm. And you've alluded to, you take great pride in being out in the field and getting
Right.
first party primary data, anecdotes, experiences as a part of the work you do. And so I have to ask, especially for the entrepreneurs listening on, where did you see opportunity for growth, improvement as you surveyed the broader supply chain as part of writing this book?
I mean, I think, all of these tech companies that have various solutions on transparency, whether it's microchips or using AI to better understand the cargo flow. I mean, this is clearly going to be with us, for decades. I mean, for the simple reason that so many of these systems within our supply chains, I'm not telling your listeners anything they don't know, are really antiquated and they don't play nicely together. It's very difficult for a shipper to know what their options are in terms of rail or truck domestically, what their shipping options are. It's very difficult to plan in terms of warehousing needs, in terms of people operating trucks, or and so I think to the extent to which we develop software solutions, technology solutions that allow greater transparency, I mean, there's certainly a lot of growth to be found there.
So I'm going to bounce us a bit far away from home. And
Sure.
you've written a lot about India this year.
Right.
And I think most people would agree that India is a growing economic power, especially as the US is trying to better understand our relationship with China and the
Sure.
rest of Southeast Asia. I'd be curious, as we think about India and its rise, who stands to benefit from growth of manufacturing in the country? Because that's something we certainly have seen a lot of, and not just kind of growth and more mention in headlines, but also folks really spending a lot of time, energy, and effort saying, where does India now sit in our supply chain?
It really depends upon how it's structured and the Indian leadership, whether we see a continuation of the crony capitalism that has characterized Narendra Modi's reign in his several terms in office to benefit, a handful of billionaires who dominate things like ports and other aspects of infrastructure, or whether the benefits are spread more broadly. I mean, the hopeful scenario is that manufacturing becomes a bigger part of India's economy, and India catches up with East Asian countries that were much earlier. We're talking decades ago to realize the benefits of manufacturing in terms of producing a real middle class. I mean, in India, one of the things that is most markedly different from other economies in the region is that women are almost wholly excluded from the formal workforce. I mean, women do a whole lot of work. It doesn't take a PhD in economics to understand that. But a lot of that work is at home or on farms, often for little or no pay. Unlike, say, China during the decades of extreme growth, where you had men and women working in factories, sending wages home to support a kid staying in school, putting them in position for white collar jobs, taking care of elderly relatives. If that sort of story could play out in India, that would be hugely beneficial, but it's going to require that women feel safer. It's going to require some cultural change as men who are not accustomed to seeing women leave and go work other places, accept that that need, and we'll have to build things like dormitories to house women, and then more broadly, we need an upgraded infrastructure. There's been a huge highway and road building project in India now for more than a decade, but it's still got a long way to go. There are a lot of huge port improvements that are planned, but they've gone slowly. That has to happen faster. At this point, all of the largest vessels are unable to dock at Indian ports, so a lot of cargo gets transshipped to places like Colombo, Sri Lanka, and Singapore. So India's got a lot of work to do to catch up, but the potential's there because so many multinational companies are cognizant that whoever wins the presidential election, in a week here in the States, the U.S.-China trade war is likely to continue, whether it's Harris or Trump, and that argues for finding alternatives to heavy reliance on Chinese factories. And India is a logical place that multinationals are looking as an alternative.
I do want to at least briefly talk about the ride along you went on with a truck driver. I guess they call them lorries there.
Yeah, most uncomfortable I've ever been in my life.
Tell us more about that. Like, what was the experience like? What did you see? What was interesting? What was perhaps shocking
Yeah.
equally? Because most people, if I had to guess, listening on the future supply chain, may not just understand how different the world is in a place like India. It's not necessarily all kind of bad or kind of backwards, but it is very different. And perhaps this could shed a bit of light into that.
Yeah, so I got the cab of a tractor trailer. It was 105 degrees Fahrenheit. That is, I think, it's like 45 or so for you Celsius fans out there. No air conditioning, as is the case in most tractor trailers. And I was in the back of the cab under a kind of plastic thatched bunk that the driver and the assistant driver used to sleep on the road. And every time we hit any pothole, my head would get smashed against a pipe above me or scratched by the ends of this plastic thatch. It was a tough day, but I did see a lot. I saw familiar sights for anybody who's been in India. Cows crossing the road, whole families on motorbikes weaving in and out of traffic, lanes not demarcated, with the truck that I was in just sticking to the far left lane. That's the slow lane. They drive on the left in India. And taking it easy, waiting for the next bunch of goats to be led across the highway or the pavement to disappear. A lot of construction, so a lot of improvements. Heard about how previously, before the Modi administration engaged in some of these reforms, every time you get to a state border, it was like traveling to another country. You'd have to submit to an inspection. You'd have to pay tax. It could take hours and hours. Now you can do all this on an app. The state borders have effectively been erased for the purposes of these regulations. So cargo does move much quicker. But as the driver put it to me, you take it slow because a lot can happen on the road. And I was struck by the fact that in 6 years in China, I certainly never heard anybody, certainly not a truck driver, say, "Yeah, we take it slow." I mean, there's that frenzy to move fast.
I love that. I love that. Coming back home, right here in the U.S., we've alluded to various versions of this concept, but nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever shoring we want to call it, onshoring, this narrative is continuing to reign strong.
Right.
And I'd be curious, kind of, what have you deciphered as being real versus not real? Because as we go out and we conduct our work, I was in Mexico earlier this year, and a lot of the folks that I was speaking to who are in and around Nuevo Leon are basically saying, yeah, like, listen, like all this can certainly happen, but we still haven't permitted a lot of these facilities.
Right.
Shovels aren't in the ground. And it's like, okay, well, perhaps our narrative is way ahead of where we truly are. I'd be curious what you're coming into and what you're finding as you're speaking with stakeholders.
Yeah, I think your observation is dead on. A lot of work's going to is going to have to get done, but I think that the look at Mexico is real, for the simple reason that whether you like it or not, if you're in the supply chain, there's a good chance that one of your own suppliers or customers is putting pressure on you to make that move. I mean, when I was in Monterey back in 2023, and I ran into all these companies I wouldn't have expected to run into. You know, there was a South Korean maker of parts for other parts that eventually feed the John Deere supply chain for tractors and construction equipment. I said, well, what are you guys doing here? And he said, well, you know, Deere is a huge customer of ours. They have a plant in Victoria, Texas. It's a couple hours from the border. And they have said, we are spooked by the, extraordinary run up in shipping prices during the pandemic. We don't want to be in a position where we're waiting for months for parts to come in. So you must set up a factory within 5 hours drive or rail of our plant in Victoria, Texas, or you're going to lose our business. I mean, that's the sort of pressure that just demands a change. But it's not as if we're abandoning China. China is very much at the center of things in terms of global manufacturing. And, I would look at it as a sort of portfolio reapportionment. I come down to look at it this way. Like, 15 years ago, if you were a retailer and you were pitching Walmart on putting your product on the shelves of a superstore, they would ask you, where are you making your product? And if the answer was somewhere other than China, you had a problem because the assumption was you couldn't be getting the lowest possible price or producing at the greatest scale. And now when you have that same conversation with Walmart, where are you making your product? They will ask you. If the answer is only China, you have a problem. They want to know, do you have some redundancy? Are you looking to India? Are you looking to Vietnam? Are you maybe looking to Mexico? Mexico, for the North American market, makes sense because you can actually make just-in-time work if you're closer. And you go back to, to the Toyota production system. I mean, Toyota, at the advent of what we now call just-in-time, was insistent on suppliers being close at hand so you could replenish as needed. And if you've got a factory in Mexico and customers in North America, you're never more than 2 weeks away. So I agree with you. It's going to take time, maybe more time than was obvious when people first started talking about Mexico. And there's security issues. The business world is pretty suspicious of the new Mexican government. Bureaucracy is bad. There are reasons to doubt. And Mexico will not, will never become the next China. But will Mexico plus Central America plus other parts of the Caribbean plus still a heavy reliance on Asia, will that become a way to kind of take out some of the risks that have built up in the supply chain? Yeah, I think that's likely, but it will be messy and it will take years.
I think it's very well put. The one thing that I really think about and grapple with is all this nearshoring really a net positive for individuals? And maybe let's zoom in a bit on us as kind of citizens of the U.S.
Sure.
Globalization brought specialization, lower costs of production that we equally benefited from with regards to lower prices in around, day-to-day items, specialty products. Are we about to, I can't help but to think, are we about to trade that all away and perhaps create another cycle of inflation as we start to lean into products that were consumed closer to home, but as a result of that may not benefit from as low cost of production or cost of inputs? I'd be curious kind of how you think about that.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think, first of all, it's a question of what else we get, right? So in a lot, it depends upon how much competition there is in an industry. So in areas like apparel, where there's obviously lots of competition, And if you and I decide to charge $22 for a pair of tube socks, I think we'll find that we'll be displaced by lots of other options. So there's going to continue to be a push for lower costs, but I think you can find efficiencies even with nearshoring and in some instances even reshoring. There'll be automation, there'll be robotics too. So you'll have less labor at a higher cost. There'll be innovation in the materials. There'll be innovation in the shipping. I don't see, of necessity, reshoring or nearshoring having to be inflationary. The question is, what do you do in industries where there isn't competition? So shipping, is basically an unregulated international cartel. When prices go up, you are padding the margins of the investor class. It's not as if the workers are getting all this extra money. So if labor costs go up, that's somehow of benefit to them. In areas where there isn't sufficient competition, we need antitrust enforcement. So there is competition, which tends to keep prices lower over the long haul. That said, though, there are some industries where costs will go higher, and there might be a strategic reason for that. Semiconductors, electric vehicles, biotechnology. Here we see the federal government actually subsidizing, essentially saying, okay, it's going to cost more to build a chip plant in Ohio or Arizona as opposed to Taiwan or China for that matter. But we see it as strategically significant to not be dependent upon, a single island that's 90 miles off the coast of China for most of the brains of modern manufacturing. So we'll pay. And in that case, that's the government paying. That shouldn't be consumers paying. So this can be done without massive inflation.
And last question before we start bringing it home. What should people kind of be monitoring, thinking about, reading, listening to in this regard as we think about nearshoring and what I call kind of the reindustrialization of the continent in its entirety? Have you found certain sources, things to be better informed and helpful to you than others?
I just think there's incredible value in talking to companies. I mean, my door's
Love
open
that.
for anybody who wants to tell me what's going on. I do find that this is an area where there's a disconnect between the academic literature and the reality that you can glimpse through journalism. I mean, I'm a big data guy. I never dismiss data, but data is backward looking, and journalism, if you do it right, is forward looking. And it's true that right now we don't see that much evidence in the data of a huge shift to Mexico, for instance. But if you talk to companies, that real investments are being made that will eventually pop up in the data. So I just think it's always easy to find somebody sitting, at a desk in New York or Washington who's got a tidy view. I like talking to analysts. I mean, analysts, if they're doing their jobs well, they are talking to companies, and so they have stuff to pass on. But I'm always interested in talking to somebody who's running a business, who has a decision to make right now. Am I putting my order in Mexico? Am I putting it in Central America? Am I sticking with China? Is there an option at home? And I find that you have to do a lot of it, so you're not just dressing up single or two or three anecdotes of some sort of broader truth. But there are insights to be gleaned from talking to people running businesses.
So with that, Peter, we've covered a lot of ground. Grateful that you've indulged us in this. But I like to finish out with something fun that I call rapid fire. So I'm going to make 3 statements, and I'd love to kind of hear your quick 15-second take on
Okay,
each of them.
you got it.
By the time this episode airs next week, the elections will be behind us. We'll probably be tabulating results, but that's first on my list, the U.S. elections.
If Trump wins, we're going to see likely elevated tariffs. They're going to be a shock to the global supply chain. If Harris wins, it's a greater mystery in terms of what her trade policy will be. But you can count on U.S.-China trade conflict continuing.
Next up, EV adoption.
EV adoption is going a lot more slowly than we thought, but it still seems inevitable. And the question is, as we embrace this technology that is of benefit for all sorts of reasons. Do we cushion the workers for this transition? A lot of UAW workers I talk to are resistant to this transition because they fear for the hit to their paychecks. They're not wrong to have looked at past experiences, whether it's trade or technology. They're not wrong to fear change. And if we want that change, we need to assure them that they will actually be given some support.
And last but not least, the labor negotiations at East Coast ports. We put those on ice a bit, but they're going to resume here soon.
Yeah, automation is going to be a key sticking point. The ILA is not going to give up on that. And again, society is right to want automation. It's natural. It's a natural human inclination. Those workers are not wrong to look at the history of how automation gets rolled out in the U.S., unlike in other developed democracies, and say, this is directly a threat to my paycheck, and I need some compensation. I need some insurance here if you're going to ask for my assent. That's going to be a sticky one.
Amazing. With that, Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to continue reading your work in the New York Times and gaining your perspective on the future global supply chains.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Cheers.
All right.
Thanks for watching. Follow us at dynamo.vc for all the latest episodes. We'll see you next time.